Afternoon, folks. Welcome to another Flycast Partners webinar. Today's topic is the programming to the user experience in Cherwell, presented by Flycast's very own senior consultant, Dean Pierce. Now, Dean is one of our senior consultants at Flycast Partners and has been implementing IT service management software as well as configuring software and using customer requirements to design incident management, problem management, change management, and processes in addition to other ITIL processes and data integrations. We also have a guest today. This was not planned and we're very happy to have him. We have Thomas Scheel, another one of Flycast Partners' very own senior consultants that is also well versed in the Cherwell tool. So we want to welcome him as well. So Dean and Tom, before we get started, let's introduce our organization. Flycast Partners is here to deliver a seriously amazing IT experience. We were founded and staffed by many personnel that have several years of experience in the IT space. We took the best ideas from these collective experiences and added the best components necessary to grow and become a leading value-added reseller in the North American IT market. We offer best-in-class implementation services and training in IT service management, IT operations management, IT asset management, workload automation spaces, artificial business intelligence, and many more, all using ITIL best practice. Our professional services team can easily scale up or down to meet the IT needs of any organization, regardless of your size, complexity, or budgetary restrictions. We offer implementation services both on-site and remote, which remote is pretty important to us right now in the world that we're living in, as well as training to reinforce your company's long-term IT success. Our ongoing remote administration and support service offerings will enable you to focus on those normal day-to-day operations, saving you both precious time and money. Feel free, reach out to us, 844-FLYCAST, that's 359-2278, 844-359-2278, or visit us on our website. We love to see you on our website. We have lots to share there. You can chat with one of our chat IT experts Monday through Friday during normal business hours. They'll be happy to talk to you. They're standing by, can't wait to talk to you. You can poke around on our website and look at all the various types of technology we offer, the different training, data sheets, white papers, process consulting, look at upcoming events, some of our publishing partner events. Take advantage of this, folks. Take advantage of our website and check it out. And if you aren't in a hurry to get an answer, you can also email us at info@flycastpartners.com. Now, without further delay, I am going to turn this over to Mr. Dean Pierce. And Dean, welcome.
Hello.
And you should be seeing the slide deck right now.
Perfect. So again, as Richard already mentioned, we're going to be covering programming to user experience. And when it comes to user experience, overall, there's the user interface and then the expectations on performance, which is more geared towards the user experience point of view. So what is overall user experience? It's defined as the process of enhancing user satisfaction with a product by improving the usability, accessibility, and pleasure provided in the interaction within the product. Now, when it comes to Cherwell, there's a couple different aspects that we're going to be looking at. We're going to be covering the overall user interface, getting more into the code level items as it relates to end user experience in the portal and the rich client, browser client, all those different areas. Go ahead and next slide. Okay, so starting off on the user interface aspect, when you're designing and enhancing your implementation within Cherwell, being consistent with the UI between the major objects, the supporting objects, and the tables, and depending on when you first started with Cherwell, in roughly about 9.6, they changed the UI completely. Different icons, different layouts, different areas within Cherwell. So the tab arrangement locations have changed. The look and the feel of the forms have changed. But overall, when you're attacking the user interface, just having a consistent UI, in the rich client, having the tab arrangement location in the same spots between the different business objects, having a clean design, having a global universal theme that can be applied throughout the application, from grids to forms to the portal, using the same colors, the icons, the different sortings, using descending orders with the ticket IDs on different grids, just being consistent throughout the entire application. When to use the related item pickers versus buttons or image or control properties will have a direct impact on certain aspects of the application. So if you guys are unfamiliar with related item pickers, it is a special form control for searching through the use of a relationship. So the best example that I can use is in the Rich client, being a service desk user and picking up the phone and saying, hello, IT help desk here, how can I help you? Trying to find the end user, you can leverage a related item picker, and it's a special control property that allows you to search for anything that is full text search enabled within one little field. So when to use that related item picker versus a prompt for a one-step versus a drop-down list versus other form controls will have an impact not only on the user interface, and we'll talk about the user experience with that specific control a little bit later, but being consistent and having certain capabilities with the related item pickers throughout the application. You need to have an idea of the target audience of who's going to be using these forms and developing towards that perspective. So getting to the information a little bit faster might be best leveraged by a related item picker, or you may need to develop a one-step that prompts for certain conditions or different states depending on the processes that you're using. The use of the icons is also very important. Depending on the version of Cherwell that you're utilizing, there might be like little images for executing one steps to zoom into a specific field that might be a rich text field. Do you want to use icons for that or text? So deciding on the use of the icons throughout the application is also a good design consideration, but consistency is the most important. Default versus portal views when we're dealing with the end user portal. So the rich client uses what's called the default view. Can you go back one slide? The default view versus the portal views. The rich client uses the default view, and in the end user portal, you can configure different portal views, but as you're developing your user interface, having consistency between both aspects of the application for a unified design is quite important, because throughout the history of your organization, what we see a lot is clients coming in and asking, we need to revamp our portal. It looks like it's stuck back in the year 2000 or the old Microsoft Access days and whatnot. So getting into a better design for the web portal, there's different views that we can expose in the portal versus the rich client or the default view. Of course, avoid white space as much as possible in order to have forms universally appearing the same way throughout the application. And then overall space considerations, and we'll get into common resolution standards here in a bit. Go ahead, next slide. So when we're talking about the portal and the very first landing page that an end user would come to, decide on what the end users need to see the most. And when designing and you want to have graphics and different buttons on the forms, decide what the end users need to see the most. A lot of the common requirements that we get is, quick links to the top 10 service requests that are used or incidents, one-touch access to certain things. So here we have a kind of mock-up to our Flynet portal that we designed a few years ago. So you'll see that we have menus at the top for the home button, and those items are consistent throughout the application, so they always appear. You have one-touch access to the service catalog, departments, other links, password reset. Those links are always accessible throughout the application, no matter where you're at, however many levels deep that you may be into a new service request or completing a form. So universal icons can be at the top, but for the main landing page, having commonly used items displayed there is a good option. But don't over design it and have too much information displayed. Try to organize it in a better way. Color and font use, leverage themes as much as possible. We've seen some clients that have different themes for the rich client versus the end user portal, or even a third one for just specifically dashboards, because there may be some minor requirement differences between those two. Use symmetrical spacing and have succinct menu options to not over clutter the user interface. Go ahead, next slide. So I mentioned the consistent UI between the rich client and or the browser client. So deciding on where to put the information and how to organize it. The updated UI that was introduced in Cherwell, and I believe roughly around 9.6, was it, Tom? Or 9.4?
It was 9.6.
9.6. So this is a sample of the updated user interface inside of the rich client. And at the top, it has global information for what needs to be displayed throughout the ticket. So as you're navigating through the different tabs in the form arrangement below, trying to identify what global information needs to be up there and always accessible. You'll see that there's created by, last modified by, the status, the SLA information, who the customer is, and the assigned team. And then having that type of a clean design consideration to put your focus towards. I already talked about the use of the related item pickers, and if you see the customer, John Wilson, in that screenshot, that specific form control allows full text searching capabilities, so leveraging that type of functionality as well. Now for the tab arrangement, the field size and the spacing, just having a consistent UI where you have like a heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, heading 4 design consideration, and typically your corporate communications department will have a UI standards guide, so trying to follow that as close as possible is possible within Cherwell, but consistency between both aspects of the application is recommended. Limit the white space as much as possible, and the use of embedded forms or the multiple forms, at least in the new UI, instead of having a large workspace where you have the left and the right side and then section or step 3, with some clients we actually take the additional questions area that's in this sample and move it to a details tab to give you a little bit more space on the overview that's more tied to the parent record or the main focus that you're on, and moving the specifics forms to a separate tab. So there are different capabilities throughout the application to make things a little bit more organized and a lot easier to navigate through.
And if I can elaborate on one little piece here, this is where user interface and user experience really do combine into understanding that there's two different topics there really. What I wanted to point out here is that if we look at this example form, there's still a lot on it. And of course, it's because there's a printer error code form there in the middle, but the rest, there's a bunch of information. When we look at user interface versus user experience, the interface itself right here is very easy to navigate. It's very clean and precise, but the user experience on filling out this form for certain items may not be, well, like let's say password resets happen all the time. If that's one of your top items that somebody might call in about, do users really want to be filling out this form with the same information, the same description, the same exact classification and priority, so on and so forth for every single one? Where when you're looking at the user experience side of it, it may be better to set up a widget or a one-step action on a dashboard or a task pane that allows them to do a one-click entry where they click the entry, say this is a password reset, and then it actually they select the customer and it auto populates most of this information for them to save them time, to get the call over quicker, but also to maintain a consistency with how that information is being entered, which is very handy when it comes to really quick items, your most popular items that are very repetitive, which enhances the user experience. However, if it's not one of those quick items, this type of a form layout improves the overall user interface side of it, where it's clean and easy to interpret.
Very good points. Next tab. So on the tab arrangement, to expand on that a little bit, inside of change control, with the updated UI and the versions, you'll notice that instead of having multiple embedded forms where you have to step through different embedded forms to move it from new to assess to approval to implement, et cetera, within a change control process, Cherwell has actually changed the embedded forms to be visible on the tab arrangement. So you can decide where you need to put these different embedded forms with this updated UI. So with older clients that have had Cherwell for a very, very long time, from a UI perspective, changing the embedded forms instead of appearing inside of another form and elevating it to different tabs makes it easier from a development perspective, but it also allows the end user to step through these items in a much more cleaner way. So it would be a global decision on where you need to place these different tabs, and if you're going to have, instead of having a lot of the global items appear on the left side, that it appears on the top now, and changing or elevating the different aspects of the application, depending on the business object, to the tab arrangement. Now, for the toolbar options, specifically in the tab arrangements, like on task, for example, you can have a new task button. Should they be able to go to the record? Should they be able to delete? You can have different tab arrangements exposed in different areas and in different aspects, depending on the end user's jobs or roles within the application as you're going through your processes. So, go ahead, Tom. You had a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring in a real life example as to how this might improve things. What I've seen a lot with many customers is that they have the old change request form. For those who are listening who may have experienced it, you actually had to change the status as well as clicking the next button to change the phase. And that again speaks to more of the user experience side than well, a little bit to the user interface as well. They overlap there, because a lot of people just want to be able to click one button to progress. And the use of these tabs, the new layout, the way they have it, enable that next button where it's next implement right there to move through those if you have the proper setup there. And it's something to consider, especially if you've used that old change request form where you had to do the double click, where moving the next to implement would change it from the classify and implement to possibly assessing or scheduling or whatever the next step may be. So I just wanted to bring that up as another quick example here of what we've seen in the past and the way that the new UI that Cherwell has put out with these form layouts could potentially be beneficial in alleviating some of that user experience woes that we may have encountered there in the past.
Right, and specifically with the switching or the one-step buttons that are on the change request of having the different visibility options, when to display the text to move to the next one, and having layers upon layers of buttons and elevating them to tabs and have visibility expressions really do alleviate the amount of development effort that needs to be put in to support those items with this new UI. So I really do like it.
I do as well.
Yeah, it makes it easier for a much cleaner implementation. Yeah, next tab. So as we start talking about the user interface, when we first start on a new implementation, I like to have a generic conversation about the overall infrastructure for IT devices that are being used throughout the system, and coming up with a consistent UI that's programmed based on a specific resolution, for example, the end user portal. If there are multiple devices that are out there, and as times change, 4K monitors are now becoming standards here and there, and getting into a lot more higher density or larger resolution monitors. But laptops are typically what I see the most restrictive as far as the UI design uh, comes into play. So, for example, there may be a lot of different models of laptops that are out there. And when we're developing towards a consistent UI as it relates to resolution, there may be specific laptop models that are out there for executives where the standard is 1600 by 900. But for a good majority of the users, they might be at their desktops, and those may be at a 1080 resolution. Or boardrooms, they may have the 4K monitors. So designing a core commonality UI based on a specific resolution, you need to come up with a base standard of what you're going to develop towards the majority. So what I see in most organizations, or what I recommend, is developing towards the 1080 resolution, and people can zoom in, zoom out. The only caveat there is with a rich client. There's a minimum resolution requirement that I think is 1024 by 768 still. But for the size of the forms, Cherwell does have, Tom, I forget the term of it.
Adaptive form
Adaptive
layout.
form layouts, that's right. So adaptive form layouts, because Cherwell has deprecated the mobile app, and they have gone the direction towards the adaptive forms. So having a minimum resolution for, I recommend 3 different devices: a mobile phone, a tablet, and then a desktop user. And what Cherwell allows within the application is it will detect the size of the resolution of the device that's accessing the portal, or that's currently displayed within the application, and using a specific form layout that was designed for that resolution. So there are capabilities within Cherwell now, especially if you're on what I think 9.3 or later. 9.3.2 I think is when it came in, roughly around that time. So you can design a lot of these forms for specific resolutions in either portrait or horizontal aspect ratios. But coming up with the minimum one that you're going to design against or towards the majority, pick the right one, and just keep the consideration in mind: desktop versus laptop users and those mobile devices. And when to use embedded forms and whatnot. Go ahead.
That I was trying to beat you to the punch. I almost got you. That is a big thing. I do want to point out that it is very important to test on various sizes, because quite often, as we've experienced within Cherwell before, if you have an embedded form and it's too small, you're going to get the double scroll bar on that embedded form. Where if you look at the different tests on the different sizes of the monitors, it may take just a little bit of time to create another form for, let's say, a 2560 by 1440 instead of a 1920 by 1080. It may take just a little bit of time to create that form. However, what you are alleviating for your users is that double scroll bar eyesore. It is necessary when their screens are not big enough. But if they have a bigger monitor with a bigger resolution and it is semi-prevalent, you don't want to do it for one person necessarily, but as long as it is semi-prevalent that somebody might have that higher resolution, you can develop an adaptive layout for that specific resolution and maybe just increase the size of the embedded form, and which alleviates that eyesore. And even small things like that are worth the time and the effort simply because the users now have a better experience. They have the bigger layout. Let's let them use it. You still want to maintain some consistency. You don't want to obviously move, stuff that was at the bottom to the top and stuff that was off the top to the bottom and left to right. But making those small changes, like increasing embedded form size or field lengths, goes a long way.
Yeah, and we can't forget about the zooming capabilities that that Windows has by default. So for rich client users, you can increase the size of the text to 150%, 200%, 300%. And depending on the implementations, or actually it's really the enterprise group policy that's allowed throughout the system, what we've seen consistently throughout an enterprise is you may have an executive that might have a laptop that zoomed at 300% because their laptop has a 4K screen, but Windows is automatically zooming in at 200%. And when accessing the rich client, it's not adaptive from, I don't know how to explain it, but from a C# code perspective, where the UI is compatible at that percentage of zoom, if that makes sense. So 150% zoom, I will put a little caveat there, is a really good alternative rather than having 300 zoom and things are too big and they start to get cut off, from the rich client perspective. So 150% is a good middle ground for that. Because with some of these embedded forms and the different UI layouts, scroll bars are an issue, but lack of scroll bars are also an issue when you're dealing with the different resolutions as well. Because you might be designing towards a 1080 resolution, and somebody may have a laptop in that resolution, but if it's zoomed at 200%, it's really more at 1366 by 768 when you look at it, because Cherwell's zooming that in, and things can get cut off. So keeping that in mind as well for your end users that are the on the fulfillment side, that are the licensed users, if they are zoomed in at that percentage, that is also another design consideration as well.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what really makes this worth the time and the effort to look into these things, is to alleviate some of those concerns. And a lot of companies just don't put enough time and effort into that I believe they should. They just want to get the functionality up and running without considering topics like this. So personally, this slide right here is something that I feel is vastly underutilized.
Right. I agree. There's a lot of capabilities that are there. And there are third-party companies out there that I'm aware of that has mobile apps that's more designed for mobile devices. But now that Cherwell has the capabilities for the adaptive layouts, you can design these forms to automatically adjust and be more efficient on mobile devices. But again, it does add another layer to the complexity of the environment and having to support multiple form resolutions. And as things change, like with the specifics forms, or adding in more enhancements, you have to keep up on that from not only the rich client or the default view, but also for the portal view for all those items as well.
Truth.
Yeah. Next slide. Okay, so from a user experience point of view, I like to cover some of the overall processing issues. So with some of our clients, we're asked to do health checks against the environment, and performance becomes a concern as time moves on and as new enhancements or requirements are developed into the system. So from a user experience point of view, some of the common items that come up is when to use a one-step versus an automated process. And the way I'd like to address it is to ask a few simple questions. What does the end user need to do in order to get this one ticket or this item submitted in the portal? Do I need to actually use a one-step, or can I elevate that to an automation process? Because if you're using a one-step on a form, let's say inside of a specifics form for a particular request, and there's a button that's on that form, does the end user actually need to click that button and wait for that one step to process, or can it be elevated to an automated process after it's been submitted? So leveraging one-step actions versus automation processes and knowing when those need to occur will help to increase your performance, such as there may be certain processes where there are one-step actions that are tied to save actions. So every single time that an end user submits a request in the portal, that it runs through and does some back-end coding. Well, the end user has to wait that entire duration for that one step to complete before they're redirected to the home page or get that confirmation prompt. So keeping in mind when these one-step actions are going to occur versus if it can be elevated to an automated process, and that's processed by the application server in the system. So that's one big area where deciding when and how one-steps need to operate in order to perform your process is a good way to speed up performance and or the overall end user experience of waiting for a ticket to be submitted can be improved on. Another item is to avoid recursive lookups. A good example is with my next item here of know what field should be auto-populated. So let's say that in the portal, clicking a new incident, it pre-populates the current logged in user as the customer, and it also populates their manager and then their manager's manager in order to try to get to a director level that primes an approval record to be created at some point through a process. Well, if you have the ability to submit on behalf of somebody else and it actually changes that customer to a different user, on the back end, it's going to auto-populate other fields in that process, and the end user has to sit there and wait for that for the auto-population to complete. And even though that we're talking about milliseconds here, there's the possibility that depending on what needs to be auto-populated, that you might get into a recursive lookup where a field is being updated by another field, which then populates another field and another field and another field. And those are recursive lookups because they could potentially be referencing each other at that point. So understanding what things need to be defaulted in the end user portal on load versus if it can be elevated towards an automation process and et cetera, et cetera. So understanding what is defaulted on load can take time away from the end user of getting to the actual fields that they need to complete. And even though that, as I mentioned, that we're talking about milliseconds, they do add up over time. Evaluating field data to the parent, avoiding the rule of two. For those developers that are familiar with that, Cherwell's rule of two is that a parent has access to its children and its children's children. That's rule of two. So going from the parent record to a child record, that's one, and then that's two. So preventing too many relationships being loaded on a brand new ticket in the portal, because that's all being loaded in memory as well. So keeping that in mind as well. Any feedback on that?
I do. I'm hoping to nip this in the bud for people who are watching. If you are having performance issues, probably the biggest cause we have found is the very last bullet point there, minimize the loading of relationships. If you are having performance problems, the first thing you should check is see if a relationship is set to load immediately. If you've experienced it, check out your services, because there is a relationship on the service record that service links, on SLA, where SLA links breach tickets, and I think there's a service links open tickets. And people don't watch those. Those will start to get into the thousands of records eventually on each of those relationships. And those are both set to load immediately, and you can turn that off. And it is also important to understand, even if you have that turned off to where it does not load immediately, if there is an expression on the form that utilizes that relationship, that triggers the load immediately. It triggers it to load that relationship. So even you might get a huge performance boost even if you've already removed the load immediately, you might get a big performance boost just by taking away a calculated label that says total number of open tickets, eliminating that label from the form, because that eliminates the loading immediately of that relationship. And if it's in the thousands of records, that is a very common performance issue that we see.
Yeah, and one of the difficult concepts to understand is relationships in Cherwell, and it took me quite a bit when I first started out to fully understand what was happening from a process standpoint. Now, Tom brought up a few good talking points right there. And depending on the relationships that need to load on when you're accessing a specific record in Cherwell, keep in mind that based on the default grid that's identified for that business object, and if there's maximum allowed fields that are also exposed on that grid, depending on the search criteria or the constraints that are loading that relationship, in memory, it is loading every single record that matches that constraint and loading all of those default, all of the items or fields that are indicated in that grid for every single record. So if you're loading up to 100,000 records, which is Cherwell's max, it's loading every single piece of detail that is exposed on that default grid. So that does take away from performance. And one relationship that I can use as an example is incident link similar, and it's matching based off of the service and the category of the ticket that you're accessing. So if it's already a submitted ticket and you have, let's say it's a password reset issue and it's one of your top 10 incidents, it's going to be loading up to 100,000 records, every single field that's exposed on that grid for every single record that matches that criteria in memory. So having it not to load immediately will allow the end user, whether it's in the portal or even in the rich client, for that ticket to load a lot faster. So that's one of the things that we do address initially when we're dealing with performance issues.
And removing those full maximum sized description fields off of the grid for something shorter.
Right. Exactly. And my recommendation, if there's anybody out there, this is free advice, remove any maximum allowed fields from your grids. That will greatly improve your performance. Next slide. So going into the one-step actions versus automation processes, I already covered this a little bit, but asking yourself a few questions of what are you actually trying to perform? Is this best suited to be executed in a one-step action, or can it be in an automation process? Do I have to prompt the end user for this specific data, or can I calculate it after it's been submitted, hence using an automation process instead? Keep in mind that save actions, the buttons on the forms, the create actions are going to be taken away from the end user experience, and it takes time for those one steps to process, especially if they're very complex and decision trees, et cetera, et cetera. So trying to have and build and ask yourself these questions of how it should be executed and where in the process it should be executed from a global perspective are some questions that you can ask initially to decide of when and where and how these things should be executed. And again, if it can be executed in an automation process, the end user doesn't have to sit there and wait for something to process. It can happen in memory on the server. Next slide. So avoiding recursive lookups. So a recursive lookup, I kind of touched on this a little bit, but it's where you have auto population occurring on a trigger of one field and it's validating against another field, and then it triggers another auto population. You can get into a recursive lookup. And how that is going to impact the system is, thankfully, Cherwell does have designed in their code to stop, I think it's roughly at 15 milliseconds if there is a recursive lookup, but it may stop the processing of your data. So if you do have auto population triggers that may be changing on behalf of, and it's supposed to pull in a manager, but it's only pulling in part of that information and not all the information that you expect, It could be that Cherwell is stopping the processing of recursive lookups, and that's why your data is not filling out completely. So going through and evaluating, do I have a recursive lookup? You have to get into the detail of the field properties to identify those. So a couple things that you can use in order to troubleshoot this, I'll talk about a little bit later, but you can throw in pop-ups in some of these one-steps. You can use the system analyzer, and to get more to a finite detail level, you can initiate a SQL trace to understand exactly what's happening when somebody's processing certain items within the system. And instead of using recursive lookups or auto population and all that kind of stuff, it may be where those processes can be elevated to a relationship instead, and then auto-populated later through an automation process. So understanding of what needs to happen where in a sequence of events type of process, you can better leverage the capabilities of the system to allow the end user to get their form completed as fast as possible and increase the performance time that's spent inside of the portal. Next slide. So again, auto-population, why do you ask your questions? Why do you need to auto-populate? Does it need to be available right now? Are there constraints for the specifics forms that are needed where you need to have that information available? If you have a lot of auto-populations, do you really need that many? Does it need to be auto-populated at that time? Because if things are auto-populating on change to other fields, keep in mind that the end user has to sit there and wait for that to process before continuing on. And a lot of the times, it's mainly related to, approval support or something like that, where, yeah, we need to pull in, the person that's submitting the record, but also if it's on behalf of somebody else, and then we need to have the customer's manager that's submitting the record, but also the on behalf of's manager as well. Well, do you need both, or is it really just for who the request is for? Do you really need to have all of those auto populations? And again, how will it be executed? Leveraging the relationships that can be executed via automation processes to fill in that information later. And there may be a better use to leverage scheduled jobs. For example, external data source updates. And asking yourself, are they actually needed based on the requirements for what you're trying to do? And getting back to the base layer of why are you trying to do this? And when does it need to occur? Does it have to occur when the end user is actually interacting with the form, or can it happen later? And it has a direct impact on the performance.
And Dean, what I want to throw in here real quick is that the example you gave about the manager stuff, there is another impact of that I wanted to throw out there. Sometimes people don't consider the fact that Cherwell is, it's SQL, it's a relational database. And one of the biggest ideas around relational databases is as little data redundancy as possible, meaning if you have a customer record that has a manager on it, you don't need to be including that manager in every single object that might use it. That's what the relationship is for. When you get to the auto-populating portion of it, one of the downsides you may see is, and a reason you avoid it unless it's necessary, is what happens if that manager changes. If your only reason for getting the requester's email, a manager's email address, is to send out during an email process, to send an email to them, try and reference that through the relationship instead, because if that manager changes, a ticket is submitted and it's got manager A on it, but then that manager changes and some process re-triggers an email later, that field on the incident object has not updated. It stays static.
Right.
But through your AD sync, you may have updated that, where if you referenced it through the relationship, you get the new manager instead. But then again, maybe you don't. Maybe you want that email to go back to the original manager, not the current manager. So these are all things to consider.
Yeah, and it's point in time in your process, because managers can change throughout the history of a ticket, or the life cycle of a ticket rather, for sure. And actually, the next slide talks about the relationships.
Let's go ahead and go to that slide. And
Okay.
that time I did beat it to the punch.
Yeah. So in this example, we're just covering the different types of relationships. You have a one-to-one, so that one ticket is related to one related record based on, you know, the child of the relationship. You have one-to-many relationships. You have a links versus owns. You have major to major, and there's database options where you can have links as own on tabs, and a lot of advanced functionality that you can throw into the system, and you can leverage relationships for those types of processes. And identifying what you really need to do when, and to reference back to what I mentioned, point in time. You know, when do these relationships need to load? Do they need to load immediately? Do they need to load everything? Do they need to load only keys only? Is it informational? Is it process driven? And having those reverse relationships where sometimes we need things to execute at the incident level. But if it's related to an approval, we need to have it at the approval focus. So designing your relationships and knowing what information needs to be loaded when and why, and reviewing these properties of these relationships will have a direct impact on how your system is performing as well. Because relationships are global to the system. It's for the entire business object based on the constraints on the links option within the relationship properties. Once these conditions are true, they will load for every single record, whether or not you need it. So understanding when these relationships need to build and if it's useful throughout that process, again, has a direct impact on performance, especially if it's a one-to-many relationship. So trying to constrain these relationships and understanding what they're being leveraged for not only has an impact on performance, but also reporting as a whole. And to Tom's point earlier, you can leverage these relationships as a point in time to send out email, and you can look through the relationship to pull that data. You may not have to use auto population to bring it onto the ticket properties itself. You can look through the relationship as a point in time. Okay, next slide. So another item is for pop-ups, and depending on your implementation of Cherwell and where you're at with your custom design, and depending on how complex that you've gotten, one item that I wanted to cover is specifically for one-step pop-ups. So what is the requirement? If there's a one-step that needs to prompt for owned by team or owned by manager, you know, prompting to make a selection with a lot of data records. Maybe you're linking to a configuration item for a down system or something. Can we constrain that pop-up? Can it be manipulated in a way where it's more efficient? Instead of giving all 100,000 records for them to search on, can we limit it based off of division or company or site? And understanding what actually needs to be processed in those pop-ups through those one steps. Can we show a list of values? Or can we, instead of prompting, can we elevate it and change it to be a related item picker? Because if I'm taking a look at a form and they have to click a button in order to search for a specific item, and I'm looking through a relationship, it might be better suited to use a related item picker instead. Because when an end user is clicking a one step, it is actually executing more items on the application layer rather than just doing database driven items through search criteria that's tied to a related item picker. So one step versus related item picker, there's different functionalities and different capabilities that you can leverage. But again, these are all layered options, and keeping in mind what is the best way to improve performance for a specific process. You just have to keep those considerations in mind.
And I also think it's really important to understand when not to use pop-ups. So definitely give that some consideration as well, because anybody who's done some of the more advanced one steps in Cherwell knows that you can design a loop, and that loops can operate for a set number of steps or a set time limit. If you put a pop-up during that loop, so after the loop initiates until when it's supposed to loop back, the default, I believe, is 30 seconds on a time limit.
Yep.
The amount of time that it takes a person to select an option from that pop-up works against you. So
Right.
pop-ups are not usually a good idea to do during a loop statement, because if somebody steps away from their desk for 30 seconds, they come back and they make a selection, the next thing that they're going to get if they needed another loop to happen is, I'm sorry, the one step has exceeded its allotted time or something like that error. And that's not good for the user experience either.
Right, and order of operation for a really, really complex one step. Sometimes Cherwell can get ahead of itself when it's dealing with certain constraints in the way that one steps are programmed out. And there are advanced functionalities within one steps to improve performance. And Tom, you are really good at this, is dealing with XML collections. It's actually faster from a performance standpoint to develop something using XML collections than it is to step through children and waiting for the one step to process and doing the GUI interface. And building out XML code is more data driven than having to, sit there and wait for the one step to process, and it takes up more memory and takes time away from the user experience point of view. So
And
there's advanced functionalities that you can leverage.
yes, and just to expand on what you said there, Dean, so that the people listening understand, XML operates faster than a database command. You can also create JSON arrays, and JSON and XML both operate faster than the database going to a relationship based off some constraints and loading the record and then executing the action. Sometimes it's faster if you're potentially looking at a long list, or if you're really trying to get that performance increased, to step through the children to just gather the rec IDs and store them in an XML or a JSON array. And then after you've gathered up all that information, when you get to the end of your one step, then you tell it to step through that collection or array and perform those actions. So that way it's operating from an XML standpoint that you've already gathered what you need, and the XML is just popping that update in there.
Right. Perfect. Well said. Next screen. So everything that we've discussed so far is leading up to the troubleshooting of what is happening in your system. And I'd like to cover the tools that I tend to leverage when addressing a performance issue. And the system analyzer is your best tool. And one area that is very difficult to troubleshoot is the portal. But the system analyzer in the rich client is very useful to understand what you've designed and what you expect Cherwell to do versus what it's actually doing. And using the system analyzer will show you exactly what Cherwell's doing. And there's advanced properties that you have to enable in order to understand what Cherwell is doing in what order, because there's other items that I don't want to go down right now, just for time purposes, but there are certain items within Cherwell, such as the ordering of the fields in if you're developing something and you add in, let's say, manager name, then manager email, and then the manager rec ID, it's going to load in that order based on the order that you created those fields in. And you may need to adjust the order of which those fields populate in order to have a better performance. And understanding what's getting populated first and then changed, that's all going to be detailed in the system analyzer. So running it on load of when you're creating a record. And then when you change a status, what happens? When you added something to the cart, what happens? When you're processing a one step, what happens? And there's a difference between what you design versus what Cherwell is actually doing from a global aspect, taking into account all the relationships that are getting loaded in the back end. Because you might develop a one step that is supposed to do one thing, but it's in the order of operation of when it executes that may present a conflict of producing a different result than what's actually happening. And there are those timeouts that happen. It's like, okay, looking through the analyzer, I expected this to happen, but it stops here. Why is it stopping there? You might have some common issues, such as too many calculations that's causing a timeout, auto-population that's causing a timeout, the recursive lookups that's stopping those auto-populations or stopping those calculations. It could be that the approval engine is trying to fire because those trigger conditions are true, and it's globally from a 40,000 foot view aspect. All of those things combined that we talked about have a direct impact on the performance and what happens when and why, and having an understanding by leveraging the system analyzer of what's actually happening in the system and where those improvements can be made. It's like, okay, this relationship shouldn't be loading right now, but it is because you have auto populations or calculations that are happening. So leveraging the system analyzer is going to be your best friend when troubleshooting these items. You know, you might have certain modifiers that are triggering other calculations. There's a lot that goes into it when troubleshooting stuff. And it may be just due to complexity in your environment. You know, you might have 5 or 7 developers all in the system developing their own path and not having a unified way to develop a system. And getting on the same page, especially if you have multiple developers, it is a very difficult thing to do, but overall having a unified design and approaching these things while keeping UI and user experience in mind will have a direct impact on performance. Any comments on that, Tom?
I've got nothing here. Pretty well said.
Awesome. Next slide. So overall, just to summarize what we've discussed, design a standard user interface from the requirements at the start of your project. If you're heading down the path of you need to have a portal refresh, you know, understanding the overall requirements from a resolution perspective, for, you know, understanding what devices are going to be connecting to the system to submit tickets at the start of the project. That way, you know how much space from a UI perspective that you have, and code to the end user's expectations while also having that performance in mind. Should this relationship be loaded at this point in time? Should I be clicking this one step to do X, Y, Z? How much time is that going to take in the end user portal? And do I need to step through children when I'm doing this? Or can I elevate that to an automation process and have Cherwell's server perform that functionality? So understanding how much time is spent by the actual physical person in front of the computer and code towards that. How much time should it actually take to fill out this form? Okay, why is it taking, you know, 15 more seconds versus, you know, 3 seconds? So code to the end user's expectations, and with that performance, you know, in the front of your mind. And be consistent. Don't overcomplicate it. A lot of times, a very complex workflow has a very simple solution, and it tends to lead towards, you know, a point in time of reference where maybe redesigning your processes. It doesn't have to be over complex in order to get the same result. We can take, you know, trim a lot of the fat out of the code by loading these relationships later, you know, and it just depends on your unique situation within the system. And know the focus and the audience that you're programming for. You might be developing a specifics form that is for an HR person versus another role in your organization. You know, understand your audience and what they expect to have. You know, you might be in healthcare, or it just depends. How much time do they actually have to submit this? So know your audience as well. If you're programming specifically for a licensed user that's in the system all day, that's used to performing these actions, or is it for the end user that's in the portal? You know, you can have 2 different aspects and 2 different workflows, but there's some common things that you have to keep in mind, like the auto population, the calculations, you know, when the relationships are loading, how much time is it taking to get from A to B? Another item is peer review, especially if you have multiple developers. I bounce things off of Tom all the time, just to make sure that I'm developing it, something in the most efficient way as possible. And for his perspective as well. Sometimes I might be, neck deep in a process and I lose my way. I need to bounce ideas off of somebody else. Peer review is a really great way to make sure that you're designing something towards a performance-based system. And always test, test, test. Use the system analyzer to make sure that Cherwell is actually doing what you expect it to do. Because there's a lot of times towards, oh, I'm just going to add this one step. But then once you add that one step in, it adds complexity, and review it. Make sure that it's actually giving you the exact results that you're looking for. Because you may find that it may complicate things from a performance standpoint.
I was going to have 2 points on this, Dean, but you added in a third. Real quick on a couple of these. So definitely put in the effort at the beginning of the project. Like you said, at the start of the project. I want to point that out because a lot of people forget. Tons of studies have been done, and doing something for every 1 hour you spent doing something up front, if you have not thought it all the way through, by the end of the project, it could take up to 100 hours to fix it if you did not think about it from the get-go. So that was point one. Definitely put the effort in at the beginning of the project. When you say don't overcomplicate, I think this is a perfect time for me to give my little spiel here about complexity versus complication. The CERN super collider is a very complex thing, but it is not more complicated than it needs to be. So just because something may seem complex does not mean it has to be complicated. And I do want to understand that, put that little difference out there. So when we say don't overcomplicate, it doesn't mean it can't be complex. You just don't make it more complicated in its complexity than it must be. In regards to the peer review, it goes both ways. Dean said he reaches out to me all the time, and that makes it sound like I'm on a different level than he is, and that's not the case at all. I reach out to Dean as well. We all reach out to each other simply because there is so much to consider about all of these, about the whole process, that peer reviews, you can miss the smallest thing and somebody else tells you, why don't you do this? And you just smack yourself in the head and go, God, I should have thought of that. So peer review is definitely a very important thing along with testing, and it's not an ego thing at all. It's just about making sure that you covered all your bases, because there's a lot of stuff you have to consider just based off the length of this webinar by itself.
Right. And to that point, there are a lot of complexities inside of Cherwell based on the version that you're on and the implementation that you had. And there are ways that we can improve upon these performance items, especially if you're going through a portal redesign or that you're introducing new processes or procedures. We can help with that. We go through health checks all the time, and there are a few key aspects where a simple meeting of the minds and just adjusting towards these types of requirements and these end goals, we can jump into your system, perform the system analyzer. There's one thing that I didn't talk about, but that's going through the health check and going through the indexes and making the performance a little bit faster from a searching capability. That also has a direct impact. But overall, with these design considerations in mind, we can help you out if you are running into performance issues and quickly identify, because we've done it, and get your system in a more usability fashion. And with that, I will turn it back over to Rich, unless, Tom, you have anything else?
Nope, I am good.
Well, with that was an amazing presentation. You guys pinging off of each other provided a lot of material there, a lot of information. I hope everybody enjoyed that. And if you have questions about what they talked about, please reach out to us at 844-FLYCAST. That's 844-359-2278. Go ahead and chat with us live on our website. And that little right side corner of the website is a little thing called a chat box, and we like to see you chatting with our IT experts Monday through Friday. They'll be happy to answer any questions for you or help you out. Or you can email us at info@flycastpartners.com. If you have any questions on this webinar, folks, we'd be happy to get the answers for you. So definitely reach out to us. We'd like to hear from you. And Dean and Tom, great job. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to help us with this.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Very good. And until next time, folks, enjoy the rest of your afternoon or day, and we will see you on the next webinar next week.